My name is Juliet. For the last 2 years, I've worked tirelessly, juggling multiple jobs, all to give my husband, Paul, and me a brighter future. But that was before I discovered he'd stolen my credit card and secretly flown to Europe. Shock and anger tore through my world, leaving me reeling from an unimaginable betrayal. Little did he know that his bold, deceitful act would unleash a side of me he'd never before witnessed. This is the story of how I fought back, exposing the truth behind his lies, proving that no one, not even my own husband, could break me forever. I remember the day I discovered the betrayal as clearly as if it happened this morning. I was standing in our cramped little kitchen, flipping through mail that rarely held any surprises, just the usual stack of bills, grocery coupons, and junk ads. Then I saw an unfamiliar envelope from a travel agency. Confused, I tore it open. Inside was an itinerary for a flight to Paris departing from New York, with additional stops in London and Rome. My husband's name was right there on the travel documents, Paul Greenwood. If the shock of seeing his name wasn't enough, the credit card statement showed the charges had gone through my own bank account. The same account I had painstakingly nurtured, year after year. I felt my heart hammer. My vision blurred as I stared at the numbers, each four-figure purchase searing itself into my brain. The agony hit me like a punch to the gut. He had stolen my credit card, booked himself a luxury tour, and set off to gallivant around Europe without telling me. Paul was not in the habit of traveling, let alone traveling alone. Even in our earliest days of dating, he'd been financially reckless. I had naively chalked up his habits to temporary misfortune, hoping my steady job would help us both find security. Yet, over time, my support transformed into enabling at least. That's how I came to see it. I paid off his debts once, then again, then again. Each time, I convinced myself that love justified the sacrifice. And now, this. Memories swirled, the nights I slaved over spreadsheets trying to plan out a workable budget, or the mornings I woke up early to pick up extra shifts at the hospital, while Paul dozed until noon. Anger welled up, forcing me to put down the documents before I tore them to pieces. I'd been so foolish. Love had blinded me to a pattern of deceit right under my nose. I staggered to our bedroom, rummaging through the drawers, until I found the empty slot in my wallet. My platinum credit card was indeed missing. My hands shook as I imagined him strolling through the Louvre, dining at expensive restaurants, laughing at my stupidity. My breath caught in my throat, torn between fury and heartbreak. It was in that moment, standing in the silent chaos of my own home, that I made a silent vow. He might think he'd taken advantage of me one last time, but I was done being his doormat. If he believed I would roll over and accept this betrayal, he grossly underestimated me. I, Juliet Greenwood, had reached my breaking point, and, for the first time in our marriage, I felt something akin to liberation rising inside me. I sat on our living room couch, the travel itinerary spread across the coffee table, the dull hum of traffic drifting through the open window. For a moment, I considered calling Paul. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe some grand explanation could magically soothe my wounded trust. But that was wishful thinking. The lines on the documents were brutally clear. Paul's departure date was last week, and he wouldn't return for another 2. He was out there, strolling along the Seine or maybe snapping photos under the Eiffel Tower. The magnitude of his betrayal made my stomach churn. I found myself replaying our past. The day we got married in a modest little ceremony, me wearing a borrowed gown and Paul wearing a slightly wrinkled tux. We'd sworn to face every challenge together. Somehow, that vow felt laughably hollow now. Had he ever truly meant it? In the early days, I had fallen in love with Paul's charm. He was witty, quick on his feet, and had a knack for making me laugh until my cheeks hurt. He could turn even the simplest dates, like a walk in the park or a burger run, into an adventure. I thought he was spontaneous, playful, a free spirit who'd keep life interesting. Then reality set in. Bills piled up, adult responsibilities gnawed at us. Paul's carefree spirit turned irresponsible fast. Whenever we faced overdue rent or car repairs, I was the one who scrambled for extra shifts or tapped into my savings. I tried to see the best in him, but each bailout left me feeling more uneasy. I thought about how he'd reacted every time I confronted him about finances. with a sweet grin or an apologetic shrug, promising he'd make it all up to me. I believed him the first few times. Then I believed him out of desperation. Eventually, I believed him because I feared confronting the possibility that he was deliberately using me. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping me from my painful reflection. It was a friend from the hospital, Tanya, reminding me about tomorrow's shift, my double shift. A wave of nausea washed over me, realizing I was the one working myself to the bone while my husband was spending my hard-earned money in Europe. Tanya's text ended with, "Everything okay? You sound tired lately." The pity in her words stung. She'd often joked that I needed a vacation. Ironically, my own husband had taken one without me, funded by me. Tossing the phone aside, I sank deeper into the couch. Rage warred with sorrow in my chest. That's when a steely determination began to form. If love had brought me here, perhaps it was time to stop relying on it to fix anything. Definitely it was time to rely on myself. It was time to stop enabling Paul's recklessness and to start figuring out how to ensure he faced the consequences of his betrayal. I woke the next morning feeling hollow and exhausted. My shift at the hospital loomed, and I dreaded plastering a professional smile on my face, when inside I wanted to scream. Still, burying myself in work was less painful than staring at the damning evidence of Paul's betrayal. I arrived at the hospital just after sunrise, greeting Tanya with a half-hearted wave. She studied me intently. "You look awful," she said, not unkindly. "Bad night?" "Something like that," I replied. My voice cracked, betraying my composure. For a second, I considered telling her everything, but I couldn't handle the pity I'd see in her eyes. Instead, I offered a small smile. "Just didn't sleep well." Tanya didn't push. She was the kind of friend who gave you space until you were ready to talk. Throughout the morning, the usual bustle of patients, doctors, and endless charts helped me focus on tasks rather than heartbreak. Though my mind was still swirling with confusion, the monotony provided a momentary shield. On my lunch break, I found a quiet corner in the staff lounge and settled into a chair with my phone. I scrolled through our joint bank account, my heart pounding. Sure enough, even more transactions from Paris, London, and Rome were piling up. Hotel suites, fancy restaurants, pricey tours. The figure was staggering, thousands of dollars. He was hemorrhaging money that I'd spent years saving. Tears brimmed in my eyes, but behind those tears was a molten anger. I tapped on my phone's financial app, selecting the option to freeze the card. Before I confirmed, I hesitated. If I froze it now, I'd lose any leverage. Paul would immediately suspect I knew. He might vanish from contact altogether, or find a way to spin the story. If he wanted to burn through all my resources, maybe I should let him think he still had free rein just long enough for me to set a trap. The thought was chilling. It was so unlike me to consider manipulation, but the betrayal was too big to ignore, and I wanted him to feel the full weight of what he'd done. If I cancelled the card, that might scare him into returning prematurely. I didn't want a half-baked apology. I wanted justice, a proper reckoning. My phone buzzed with a text from Tanya, letting me know she needed help in the ER. I closed the financial app, leaving the account open, painful as it was. Soon enough, Paul would get one last shock. The difference? This time, I'd be the one in control. By the end of the day, my resolve had grown. No matter how it hurt, I would see this through. Paul might think he'd outsmarted me, but I wasn't the naive woman he used to manipulate. He'd turned our marriage vows into a sham, and I was prepared to make him face the consequences, every single one of them. The day had drained every last bit of my energy. After enduring a non-stop shift at the hospital, I could barely keep my eyes open on the drive home. My mind, however, was anything but tired. An endless loop of questions kept repeating in my head. How could Paul do this? How long has he been planning it? How much money has he already spent? Each thought left a knot of tension in my stomach, as though every inhale hurt and every exhale threatened to bring tears. By the time I finally turned the key to my front door, a deep sense of dread had settled over me. The house was dark, the hallway light off exactly the way I'd left it that morning. Yet it felt different, somehow emptier. I set my purse on the small entry table and kicked off my shoes, summoning enough willpower to confront the files and bank statements I knew were waiting for me in the living room. The previous night, I had discovered that Paul, my husband, had booked a flight to Europe using my platinum credit card. He'd not only booked a flight, but arranged an entire itinerary: Paris, London, Rome. The charges were all in my name. He had quietly taken the actual card from my wallet and vanished, leaving me to uncover the truth after the fact. Now, I felt compelled to piece together the full extent of his betrayal. I perched on the edge of the sofa, then reached for my laptop on the coffee table. I navigated to my online banking page, anxiety threading its way through every muscle in my body. The site loaded far too slowly, making my heart pound even harder in anticipation. Finally, a series of transactions appeared on the screen. Luxury hotel in Paris, upscale restaurant reservation, high-end boutique in London, guided tour in Rome. My mouth went dry. He was hemorrhaging my money. The list of expenses scrolled on, each transaction marked by exotic locations and staggering price tags. The last charge, appearing barely 6 hours ago. I felt my chest tighten with fury. And something else, too grief for the marriage I thought we had. In the corner of the screen, I saw the freeze card option. My finger hovered over it. Every logical bone in my body told me that I should cut off his access to my funds immediately. If I let this go on much longer, he could destroy my credit, sabotage my financial future. But I hesitated. The possibility of confrontation threatened to unfold in messy ways. If I froze the card now, he'd know I was onto him. He'd scramble to cover his tracks. He might even vanish from contact altogether, especially given how shameless his theft had already been. I couldn't let him off the hook that easily. If he wants to milk me dry, he should at least face the consequences in full. That thought pulsed through my mind, bringing a surge of anger but also a strange sense of power. I clicked away from the freeze card button, deciding to wait for now. I needed more evidence. I wanted to see how far he'd go and gather everything I could to build an irrefutable case against him, should I decide to pursue legal action or a divorce. A faint light from the kitchen reminded me I hadn't eaten since lunch, but the thought of food made me nauseous. My pulse was racing too fast to accommodate anything resembling normal appetite. Instead, I grabbed a glass of water and paced the living room. I tried to recall every conversation Paul and I had shared in the past few weeks. Had there been any hints of his plan? A slip of the tongue about traveling? A sudden fascination with European culture? Nothing came to mind. He never even said goodbye. My throat constricted. Despite the anger, there was a deep ache in my chest at the realization that the man I once trusted completely had betrayed me with such callousness. My phone buzzed. The screen showed a text from an unfamiliar number. The message read, "Hey babe, I'm in Rome. Tried using your card, but it got flagged. Is everything okay with our bank? Let me know." My vision blurred with fury at that final phrase, "our bank." He didn't even bother to pretend it was a mistake. The nerve of this man to call it our bank when he knew exactly what he'd done. Anger prickled every inch of my skin. Still, I had to be strategic. I typed a reply, paused, then deleted it. I closed my eyes, inhaling slowly until some semblance of calm returned. If I responded now, I'd reveal too much. My best move was to let him wonder, let him think I was simply clueless or temporarily out of touch. He wants to manipulate me. Let's see how he likes it when the tables are turned. I sank back into the couch, letting the phone slip from my hand. A sense of isolation weighed on me. The walls of the house felt closer somehow, as if they could sense my despair. For a moment, I thought of calling Tanya, my friend and co-worker at the hospital, but it was nearly midnight. Exhaustion clung to every corner of my mind. Instead, I turned on a nearby lamp and gazed around the living room. My eyes fell on the small wooden chest I'd tucked beneath a side table. Inside were old documents, some of Paul's, some of mine, that I never bothered to organize. Without really deciding to, I found myself pulling the chest out, rummaging through dusty folders and envelopes. First, I stumbled on an old receipt for a deposit on a romantic weekend getaway we had supposedly booked a year ago. Paul had cancelled that trip at the last minute, claiming the travel agent had messed everything up. At the time, I'd believed him without question. We never went, and I never saw the refund. Next, I found a series of pay stubs from a job Paul once had. He'd lasted only 2 months before quitting, complaining about the boss's unrealistic expectations. Skimming those pay stubs, I realized there were gaps, weeks, or even months, He claimed he was between opportunities, all the while living off my salary. I gathered these receipts in my lap, my heart thudding against my ribcage. How many times have I swallowed Paul's excuses? The truth was humiliating to face. I had ignored a forest of red flags, comforting myself that a better day lay just around the corner. One more envelope caught my eye at the bottom of the chest, a set of typed notes titled Startup Idea #4. It was from the time Paul declared he'd found an incredible investment, some kind of online venture that would revolutionize our finances. I remembered pouring my savings into his plan, only to have it evaporate. He'd insisted it was just bad timing, that the market had shifted. Now, in retrospect, I wondered if he'd ever invested that money at all. I placed the notes back, hands shaking. My entire marriage flashed before me, a collage of half-baked business ventures, lost savings, and quiet assurances that everything would be fine. I was so blind. But self-blame wouldn't help me now. I swallowed hard, a bitter taste in my mouth. I needed to stand firm or risk losing everything, including my self-respect. As I closed the chest, a plan began to crystallize in my thoughts. If Paul thrived on illusions, I could weave one of my own. Let him think I hadn't noticed the missing credit card yet, or that I was too swamped with work to pay attention. Meanwhile, I'd keep screenshotting every transaction, every text message. I'd protect my finances behind the scenes while letting him play out his fantasy of a free European jaunt. Not realizing the hammer was about to fall, I reached for my phone again, reading that last text from him in Rome. My anger still simmered, but beneath it was a growing sense of determination. He thinks I'm a doormat, a pushover. He has no idea who he's dealing with. It was nearly 1:00 a.m. by the time I turned off the lamp. My mind buzzed with plans for the coming days, visiting my bank to discuss partial freezing of my account, contacting a lawyer for a preliminary conversation, sorting out the best way to ensure Paul's actions. Left a clear paper trail of theft. I would need all the proof I could get if I decided to file charges or demand restitution. Before heading to bed, I paused in the hallway, flicking on a light to study myself in the mirror. I barely recognized the woman reflected back at me. My eyes were puffy from crying, and my hair hung limply around my face. But there was a new intensity in my expression, a hardness in my gaze that spoke of someone who had finally hit the tipping point. Enough, I whispered to my reflection. Enough lies, enough excuses. Enough being someone else's victim. The words felt strangely empowering. I wouldn't let Paul's betrayal define my life. If he wanted to treat me like an endless well of money, I would show him that well could go dry and then come crashing down on his head. Pulling myself away from the mirror, I trudged to the bedroom and flicked off the lights. Darkness enveloped me, but instead of fear, I felt a small spark of triumph. Yes, I was exhausted, and my heart was raw with hurt, but I was no longer drowning in ignorance. I had a strategy, a sense of direction. He doesn't know I'm onto him, I reminded myself, and that's going to be his greatest mistake. Closing my eyes, I allowed a few silent tears to roll down my cheeks. I'd never asked for this kind of war within my marriage, but if it was a battle Paul wanted, I had no choice but to fight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more lies to uncover, and more steps towards safeguarding my future. And I would be ready. That night, despite the turmoil, I slept more soundly than I expected, armed with a steely resolve. I would not be a victim of Paul's schemes any longer. He might be roaming the streets of Rome, confident he'd pulled off the perfect crime, but a reckoning was coming, and it would begin the moment he stepped foot back on my side of the ocean. The next morning, over a hastily eaten bowl of cereal, I dialed my bank. My hands were clammy on the phone as I navigated the automated menu, eventually reaching a representative. Her name was Diana, and she had a calm, no-nonsense tone that instantly made me feel less alone. I explained my situation carefully. My husband had taken my credit card without my authorization and had been charging extravagant expenses abroad. I wanted to know my options. Diana listened quietly. When I finished, there was a pause on the other end. "I'm so sorry this is happening," she said, genuine concern in her voice. "Have you filed a police report?" Police. The word made my stomach lurch. I hadn't fully considered going that far yet. "No, not yet," I admitted. "I see," she replied. "If the card usage is truly unauthorized, you might want to consider it. However, if you're married and share some finances, it can get complicated. Legally, your husband might have partial access to accounts unless you specified otherwise. But if you can prove he took your card without permission, that's a different story. We can flag the transactions as fraudulent, though we do need official documentation. I closed my eyes. This was bigger and scarier than I'd initially let myself believe. Filing a police report felt like crossing a point of no return. Before we ended the call, Diana placed a temporary hold on the account, one that wouldn't immediately notify Paul unless he tried to make another large purchase. That gave me a window to decide my next steps. After thanking her, I placed my phone on the kitchen counter, heart drumming in my ears. As I stood there, a wave of clarity washed over me. If I didn't act decisively, Paul could ruin my finances and what remained of my emotional well-being. All the times I'd convinced myself to wait, to try, to fix things, had only led to a deeper betrayal. Resolute, I began searching online for divorce attorneys, scribbling down names and numbers. My stomach turned at the thought, but my fury and sense of survival overrode the pangs of heartbreak. I needed to protect myself. An hour later, I had an appointment scheduled with a law firm for the following week. Just as I was about to lock up and head to work, the doorbell rang. To my shock, it was my neighbour, Elena. She was an older woman who occasionally waved at me in passing, but we'd never spoken beyond small talk. She held a stack of mail in her hand, my mail, apparently delivered to her address by mistake. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said gently, handing over the envelopes. "You've looked so stressed lately. Is everything all right?" Maybe it was the unexpected compassion in her voice, or maybe I was on the verge of an emotional break. Without meaning to, I told her everything in a trembling rush, and to my surprise, Elena listened intently, her brow creased with concern. When I finished, her expression hardened. "Don't let him get away with it, sweetheart," she said firmly. "You deserve better." Her words echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. I realized that, for the first time, I was allowing myself to believe them. That evening, I found myself idly spinning my wedding ring around my finger while I scrolled through my phone. Social media was a minefield, family and friends, posting pictures of summer vacations or cozy nights in. None of them had a clue about the storm raging in my life. It struck me how easy it is to present a facade. I'd done it countless times, smiling at gatherings with Paul, acting like we were the perfect couple when in reality my finances were a battlefield. Now, I wanted to tear that facade apart and show the truth, but shame held me back. The fear of judgment, the fear of pity, it all felt suffocating. I placed the ring on the table, staring at it under the warm glow of the lamp. A stark reminder of vows, for better or worse. But how do you uphold vows with someone who's stolen from you? I jumped when my phone vibrated. A text from Paul. Again, from that unknown number. "Paul, why aren't you answering? Are you okay? Please talk to me." The hypocrisy of his concern soured my stomach. Despite my anger, I recognized the fear lurking behind his words. Maybe he'd tried to use my card again and discovered the hold. Maybe he was realizing that his carefree spree was endangered. I typed and deleted half a dozen responses before deciding to say nothing at all. Let him sweat. Each time I thought of responding, a mental image of him sipping wine in a Roman cafe on my dime burned in my mind, and I felt my resolve strengthen. Still, the weight of it all pressed down on me. I paced around the living room, rummaging through the chest of drawers for anything to distract myself. My hand froze when I found a folder labeled Paul's documents. Inside were old pay stubs, job applications, and receipts from various business ideas he'd claimed would make us rich. Rifling through them, I uncovered half-truths and pipe dreams, each carefully curated to look like a legitimate attempt at bettering our future. But now, it read like evidence of an elaborate performance. The sickening realization that I had funded every last one of them, rent, groceries, even the occasional fancy date night, bubbled up again. I paused on one receipt from nearly a year ago, a deposit for a couple's getaway we'd never actually taken. He'd cancelled it, claiming the travel agent messed up. Now I wondered if that was just another lie. Maybe he'd pocketed a refund and never told me. In that moment, a new idea formed. If Paul liked illusions, maybe I could create one of my own. The next time he tried to contact me, I'd let him think I was blissfully unaware, that I was still the doting wife ready to welcome him back. I'd keep the final blow hidden until he was standing right in front of me, unable to deny the truth. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of power warming me from within, a glimpse of the strength that had been overshadowed by heartbreak. Over the next few days, I honed my plan. Each morning, I'd check my accounts, watching Paul's reckless spending tick upward. Diana's subtle hold on the card meant smaller transactions might still sneak through, but any massive purchase attempts would be flagged. He was playing a deadly game with my money, apparently trying to stay under the radar. At work, I maintained a veneer of normalcy. Tanya pulled me aside once to ask if I was all right. I couldn't bring myself to share the full horror, but she sensed my turmoil. "If you need anything," she said softly, "I'm here." I offered a small nod, swallowing tears. Meanwhile, Paul kept texting. His messages ranged from apologetic to angry. "Paul, I'm serious, Juliet. You need to respond. Something weird is happening with our card." I nearly laughed at his use of our card. Instead of replying, I took screenshots of each text, cataloguing them for what I started to think of as an evidence file. If divorce or legal action loomed, I wanted a record of everything. Finally, after a week of ignoring him, I let one text slip through. Me via text, "Hey Paul, phone's been acting up. How's your trip? Everything okay?" It was a masterstroke of subtlety, a message that feigned ignorance. Within minutes, my phone buzzed wildly. "Paul, thank God," you replied. "Listen, something happened with the card. I can't use it for big purchases. I'm short on cash. Can you send me some money or unblock it? I promise I'll explain everything when I'm back." I read that line over and over, bitterness pooling in my stomach. He was basically demanding more funds from me. Resisting the urge to rage, I typed back, "Sure, babe. I'll see what I can do. Glad you're having fun." My thumb hovered, wanting to add a snide remark. I held back. This game required patience. Let him believe I was the clueless, compliant wife, buying time until I could ensure he faced real accountability. Later that evening, I had my consultation with a divorce attorney, Leslie Mayfield. She was a sharp, middle-aged woman with watchful eyes that missed nothing. After hearing my story, she leaned back in her chair, fingertips pressed together. "Financial abuse in a marriage can be grounds for divorce," she said. "If you can prove he stole the card without your permission, you have a very strong case. Do you want to proceed?" I hesitated, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. It was terrifying to think about unraveling my entire life, but it was equally terrifying to think of staying with a man who had so blatantly harmed me. "Yes," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I do." Leslie nodded, sliding a business card across the table. "We'll need documents, text messages, any evidence you've got. Once he's back, we can move forward with serving him if that's what you decide." Walking out of her office, I felt both terrified and oddly empowered. I was crossing a line, stepping onto a path where my illusions of a normal marriage would crumble. But perhaps, in that rubble, I'd finally find solid ground to stand on. Life became a balancing act of normalcy and covert planning. I had to manage my shifts, keep Tanya off my trail, and maintain the ruse with Paul. I continued to send him placating messages. "Hey honey, any souvenirs for me? Enjoy Rome. I can't wait to hear all your stories." Reading his replies made my blood boil. He'd send pictures of upscale restaurants, cathedrals, and scenic vistas, always with a hint of guilt in his words, but never a full confession. He was still the lead actor in his own performance. "I just needed a break, babe. I'll make it up to you." Behind the scenes, I was gathering ammunition. Leslie helped me draft a preliminary statement detailing how Paul had stolen my credit card. She walked me through the complexities of fraud within a marriage, cautioning that in many states, shared debt is tricky. But the fact that he'd taken it without permission, plus my documentation, bolstered my stance. One evening, my neighbour Elena invited me over for tea. I arrived, tension coiled in my chest. It was strange, finding support from a woman I'd barely known. But the moment she opened her door, she waved me in warmly. Her home was a cozy space, smelling of cinnamon and chamomile. I sank into an armchair, feeling oddly safe. She listened as I updated her on the recent developments. Elena's expression darkened at the mention of Paul's text messages. "He's shameless," she muttered, pouring tea into a flower-patterned cup, going around Europe on your savings and then crying poor when he can't spend more. I sipped my tea, its warmth soothing my frayed nerves. It's like I'm watching a stranger, someone so uncaring, so manipulative. I never thought he was capable of this. Elena shrugged, her expression tinged with pity. Maybe he was always capable, and you just didn't see it. Love can blind us, dear. Her words settled in me uncomfortably. The truth can be harsh. I stared into my teacup, remembering how I used to brag that Paul had such a big heart, how he'd help stray animals, or volunteer at local shelters. Yet, those memories clashed with the man currently draining my finances. I'm filing for divorce, I said softly, letting the admission float into the cozy air. I can't see any other way. Elena reached out and squeezed my hand. It won't be easy, but once you get through this, you'll never question your strength again. Over the next hour, we discussed logistics, things like changing the locks on my doors, gathering more evidence, possibly alerting a couple of close friends so they could have my back if Paul tried to gaslight me upon returning. Each practical step gave me a sense of control. By the time I left Elena's house, night had fallen. I gazed at the lights in my own living room window across the street. So much had changed in such a short time. Yet, one thing became clear. I wasn't alone, and I refused to be a victim. Days turned into a fortnight, and Paul's messages grew more insistent. He complained about unexpected expenses in Europe and insisted I fix the card issues. I offered vague promises, telling him I was handling it through the bank. In reality, I was finalizing every detail of our split. Leslie and I drafted divorce papers citing financial abandonment and fraudulent misuse of my credit. We set them aside, awaiting his return. Meanwhile, I updated the locks on our home, making sure that if he tried to sneak back in, he'd find himself literally shut out. I also confided in my closest friend from high school, Miriam. She lived an hour away, so we rarely saw each other in person these days. But over a long phone call, I poured out the entire ordeal. My tears finally came. Unstoppable now that I was talking to someone who'd known me before I met Paul, who remembered my bright dreams of a fairy tale marriage. "This is so messed up," Miriam said, voice cracking with empathy. "He's scum, Jules. I'm sorry, but I can't mince words. You deserve so much more." Relief, shame, and gratitude all washed over me simultaneously. For so long, I'd kept Paul's financial failings hidden, carrying a sense of loyalty or maybe misguided love. But his Europe stunt had blown up that secrecy, exposing the rot beneath. Miriam insisted she'd take a day off work to come support me when Paul returned. "I want to be there in case he tries any manipulative nonsense," she said firmly. Her protective tone made me smile through tears. Paul's flight was scheduled for the following Monday, at least according to the itinerary I'd discovered. The day before, I spent hours pacing around the house, heart pounding at every passing car. Anxiety churned in my stomach. Even though I'd prepared meticulously, I couldn't stop imagining worst-case scenarios. What if Paul turned violent? What if he refused to leave? Fear tightened my chest. But I tried to quell it with logic. I'd changed the locks. Elena next door was ready to call the police if needed. And if it came down to it, I could show the authorities my documentation of fraud. Sunday night, I barely slept. I dreamed of Paul bursting through the door, brandishing receipts from Paris, screaming that I'd ruined his trip. I woke up drenched in sweat. The sheets tangled around my legs, my wedding ring on the bedside table glinting under the lamp. The sight of it made my stomach twist. Morning arrived too soon, the sunlight creeping in through half-drawn curtains. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, noticing new lines of worry on my face. But behind them lay a resolute determination. This was the day. The trap was set, and whether I was ready or not, Paul would walk right into it. Paul arrived in the early afternoon. My heart lurched when I heard his knock on the door. He must have tried his key first, only to find the locks changed. The knock was forceful, insistent. I glanced at the phone in my hand. Miriam was on standby, and I'd told Elena to be ready to call the authorities if things went sideways. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door to face my husband, or rather, the person who had once been my husband. He stood there in wrinkled clothes, a suitcase behind him, his eyes wide with a mixture of panic and anger. "What's going on?" he demanded, gesturing to the new lock. "Why can't I get in my own house?" I forced myself to remain calm. Because you don't live here anymore. He blinked, clearly caught off guard by my cold tone. Then came the theatrics. Honey, I know you're mad, but let me explain. I needed some time off. I cut him off. Time off? You stole my credit card, Paul. Flew to Europe and racked up thousands in charges. Do you have any idea what you've done? He avoided eye contact, his shoulders sagging as he tried to push his way inside. But I stepped forward, blocking his path. Move, he said, voice low. I'm tired. Let's talk about this inside. No, I replied firmly. We'll talk here. Shock flickered in his eyes. In our past arguments, I'd always yielded, always let him talk his way out of blame. Not this time. Okay, he said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Look, I'm sorry, all right? I was planning to pay you back. I needed a break from the stress. And I thought, stop lying, I snapped. You never told me you were leaving. You never asked for permission to use my card. You never even apologized until I cornered you. He tried a wounded look, something that might have worked on me in the past. Are we seriously doing this on the front porch? Can't you let me in so we can talk like adults? Behind me, the house was silent and off limits to him. It struck me that this was the first time he'd felt unwelcome in what used to be our home. A twisted part of me was glad he was uncomfortable, even humiliated. He deserved that much. Fine, I said, stepping aside, letting him drag his suitcase into the living room. The furniture, pictures, everything was the same, and yet the space felt undeniably different, as though my spirit had claimed it, pushing him to the fringes. As soon as we were inside, I walked over to the coffee table where a neat stack of papers awaited bank statements, text message printouts, the divorce papers. I turned to face him, my heart pounding but my voice steady. You want to talk? Let's talk about consequences, Paul. Paul stared at the stack of documents, an uneasy flicker crossing his face. What is all this? He asked, though I suspected he already knew. I stepped forward, arms folded. Evidence, I said quietly. Proof of what you did. Screenshots of your text messages admitting you took my card. Statements showing every single purchase you made in Europe. And these I tapped the top sheet are divorce papers. The colour drained from his face. Divorce? He echoed, as though the word itself was foreign. Are you serious? You can't be. We can work this out. Work this out. I echoed, a brittle laugh escaping my lips. You literally committed fraud against me. You left me to foot the bill while you played tourist in Europe. He shook his head, his voice tinged with desperation. Wait, you said you'd block the card, but I thought it was just a glitch. I messed up, Juliet, but you can't just throw everything away over this. Something in me snapped. Throw everything away? You did that the second you walked out of here with my card in your pocket. The second you decided you'd rather steal from me than have a real conversation. He sank onto the couch, head in his hands. I was going to pay you back, he muttered. I was. Once I found a job. You've been telling me that for years, I cut in. My voice softened slightly as tears threatened to spill. Paul, I loved you. I stood by you when you kept messing up. But I'm done. This was the final line you crossed. He looked up, eyes misty. So you're just ending it? No second chances. My heart clenched. Despite everything, there was still a part of me that remembered the good times, the nights we stayed up talking, the shared dreams of a future. But those memories felt distant, overshadowed by the magnitude of his betrayal. It's too late for second chances, I said, forcing my voice to remain resolute. I've given you more than enough. I slid the divorce papers across the coffee table toward him. You can sign these now or later, but I'm filing them either way. He stared at them, disbelief etched into every line of his face. Why are you doing this to me? He choked out. Anger flared in my chest. Why am I doing this to you? You did this to me, Paul. You have no one else to blame. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We were two strangers in what used to be our shared life. Finally, he broke the silence. I don't have anywhere to go. His admission hung in the air. Once upon a time, those words would have melted my heart, made me swoop in and fix everything. But I had nothing left to give. I turned away, blinking back tears. That's not my problem, I whispered, heading toward the door. I'm done being your safety net. And with that, I left him sitting there, confronted by the rubble of our marriage consequences he never imagined he'd have to face. I went outside, shutting the front door behind me. The late afternoon sun felt like a spotlight on my turmoil. My hands trembled. I leaned against the porch railing, taking gulps of air to steady myself. Moments later, I heard raised voices inside Paul cursing under his breath. Then the front door swung open. He dragged his suitcase out, glaring at me with an expression of betrayal, as though I was the one who'd wronged him. "So, that's it?" he spat. "You're kicking me out, just like that?" I met his gaze evenly. "Yes, Paul, just like that." He muttered something under his breath and stalked toward his car, a rusted sedan he'd rarely used. I watched as he wrestled his suitcase into the trunk. Turning back, he yelled, "You'll regret this, Juliet!" My stomach twisted, but I refused to show fear. "That's my line," I shot back, voice trembling with the weight of finality. With a slam of the door, he was gone, tires screeching down the street. I stood there, numb, the echo of his words hanging in the air. Eventually, I heard footsteps on the sidewalk. I looked over to see Elena, arms crossed as she surveyed the scene. "You okay, dear?" she asked gently. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak for a moment. My throat was tight, eyes stinging. Finally, I managed, "I think so." She placed a comforting hand on my arm. "You did the right thing." I gave a shaky smile. "I know, it hurts." "Of course it does," she said softly. "But this wound will heal, and you'll be stronger for it." I thanked her and headed back inside, my legs feeling like lead. The living room was eerily silent now. The stack of documents on the coffee table remained, a symbolic monument to the life I was leaving behind. My phone buzzed with a call from Miriam. Her timing was impeccable, I answered, voice quivering, and she asked how it went. I relayed the short version, Paul's shock, my insistence on divorce, his departure. "Proud of you, Jules," she said. "I'm coming by tomorrow if that's okay. We can go get dinner, my treat." I exhaled, relief washing over me. The idea of a friendly presence, someone who knew me and didn't judge me, gave me something to hold on to. "Yeah, that sounds great," I said, tears threatening again. This time, they were tears of release rather than despair. We hung up, and I sat on the couch, alone in the quiet house. Strangely, my mind wandered to how I'd decorate the living room differently once Paul was officially out of my life. Maybe I'd finally paint the walls a soft lavender, something Paul had always dismissed as too girly. It was a trivial thought, but it made me smile a small ember of hope. I might be bruised, but I wasn't broken. This was the aftermath of truth. And somehow, amid the wreckage, I was beginning to see possibilities for a better future. The days that followed brought a whirlwind of legal paperwork and emotional flux. Leslie, my lawyer, filed the divorce petition. Paul sent a barrage of texts and voicemails, swinging between pleas for forgiveness and threats. I saved every single one, forwarding them to Leslie. She reassured me he was just lashing out, that legally he had little ground to stand on. Tanya at the hospital noticed something different about me. She cornered me in the break room one afternoon, eyebrows raised in concern. "Spill it," she demanded gently. "You've been distracted," then suddenly almost. "Relieved?" I hesitated, but the words burst out in a torrent. I told her everything, Paul's theft, the divorce, the confrontation. She listened without judgment, her eyes gleaming with empathy. "Oh, Juliet," she breathed when I finished. That's huge. Are you okay?" For the first time in a while, my smile felt real. "I think I will be," I said. "It's been hell, but I'm starting to feel free." Tanya pulled me into a hug. "You deserve every bit of peace and happiness," she whispered. Outside of work, one faced the practicalities of rebuilding my finances. The bank, with Diana's help, recognized the transactions as unauthorized. Paul's text messages and my statement to them sealed the deal. They assured me that I wouldn't be liable for the most egregious charges. Some smaller amounts might remain disputed, but in the grand scheme, I wouldn't be financially ruined. It was a weight off my chest. During evenings, I found solace in small acts of self-care, reading novels I'd neglected, soaking in long baths, rediscovering my love for painting. The house felt strangely larger without Paul's presence, but it also felt like it was truly mine for the first time. Miriam visited, as promised, sweeping me off to a cozy Italian restaurant. Over decadent pasta and a shared bottle of wine, we reminisced about our teenage years, laughed about high school crushes, and in those laughter-filled moments, I felt the layers of tension peel away. The betrayal still stung, but it wasn't the entire shape of my life anymore. As the divorce proceedings moved forward, I decided to declutter the house of Paul's belongings. Anything he hadn't bothered to take or didn't claim, I boxed up. The silence of the home was punctuated by the rustling of cardboard, and the occasional memory that surfaced a gift he'd given me for a birthday. A photo of us on a beach vacation. I allowed myself a moment to grieve each memory, then tucked it away. One afternoon, as I stacked the boxes in the garage, I caught my reflection in the mirror we once hung in the hallway. I looked tired, yes, but also surprisingly strong. My eyes held a fire that I hadn't seen before. I realized that I was on the cusp of a new chapter, one I would write on my own terms, unshackled from a man who drained my spirit. That day, I hung a new painting in the living room, an abstract swirl of blues and golds. It symbolized the chaos I'd been through, shot through with streaks of bright possibilities. As I stepped back to admire it, I smiled. This was my home now, and I was ready to fill it with a future guided by my own light. Weeks later, the divorce papers were all but finalized. Paul, facing potential criminal charges if he contested the fraud, begrudgingly signed, though he tried to negotiate for some type of spousal support. My lawyer scoffed at that request. He had no leg to stand on. Ultimately, he withdrew his claim in the face of overwhelming evidence of his financial betrayal. I closed the chapter on that toxic relationship, stepping into a fresh sense of self-worth I hadn't realized was possible. It wasn't that the pain vanished overnight. I still felt pangs of anger, betrayal, and sometimes even sadness. But each day, the wound healed a bit more. My finances weren't completely back to normal, but I had a repayment plan with the bank. My credit score took a temporary dip, yet the knowledge that I'd rescued myself from an even deeper pit kept me motivated. Work at the hospital continued to be a sanctuary, and Tanya remained a steadfast friend. She marveled at how I looked more alive than ever. Elena next door became an unlikely confidant, sharing wisdom gleaned from her own past heartaches. Over cups of tea, we swapped stories about life's curveballs. She often reminded me that real growth can spring from pain, as long as we face it head-on. Miriam checked in every week, sometimes coaxing me out to social gatherings or day trips. One Saturday, she dragged me to a local art fair, where I found myself inexplicably drawn to a booth selling handmade glass pendants. The artist, a warm-faced man named Owen, chatted with me about the meaning behind each piece, how shattered glass could be remade into something beautiful. Something about his words resonated deeply. As the fair wrapped up, Owen pressed a small sky blue pendant into my hand. "A gift," he said with a shy smile, "for someone who appreciates how broken things can become art." A flush crept across my cheeks, and I realized it was the first time in a long while that I felt a genuine spark of connection. Nothing serious, just a gentle reminder that kindness and possibility still existed in the world. That night, I dropped into my bed, pendant in hand, a small smile gracing my lips. The day had been simple, yet restorative. In that moment, I understood that my life wasn't defined by Paul's betrayal, it was defined by how I responded to it. I had chosen to fight back, to stand tall, and that choice had opened doors I never knew existed. In the quiet warmth of my own home, I acknowledged that the future was uncertain, but it was mine. I was no longer the naive wife, funding another person's escapism. I was Juliet, a woman scarred but not broken, courageous enough to trust in her own strength and worthy of genuine love perhaps one day, with someone who respected both my heart and my boundaries. And so I drifted off to sleep, hopeful, at peace, finally ready for the next chapter of my life. Thank you for walking beside me on this journey of betrayal, resilience, and self-discovery. My story is a testament that, while heartbreak can push us to our limits, it can also spark a transformation we never thought possible. If you found strength in my struggle and triumph, please show your support by clicking like and sharing this video with anyone who might need a reminder of their own courage. And if you'd love to see more stories of defiance, healing, and perseverance, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Your support not only keeps these empowering narratives alive, but helps spread hope to others navigating tough times. Remember, true power lies in our ability to rebuild, and sometimes the hardest moments of our lives pave the way for the brightest tomorrows. Thank you for watching. and I'll see you in the next story.